We'll be hearing first from Keith Gildart, Professor of Labour and Social History and ex-miner. Keith worked as an underground coal miner for 7 years, then studied at the Universities of Manchester and York, and he's going to talk to us today about the historiography of the strike and his role in saving the NUM archives. Then we're going to hear from Liz Wood, who is a project archivist at the Modern Record Centre, also on the library's collection subcommittee. And Liz has been at the MRC since 2006 and is currently undertaking an enormous job of cataloguing the archives of the NUM. And finally, we'll wrap up with our archivist here at the Marx Memorial Library, Matt Dunne, who'll be making some connections, I think, across the panel, and also talking about his own experience cataloguing our print workers collection, where there's some interesting ties. Right, over to you.
Thanks, and it's great to be invited to this library. I haven't visited for a long time. Great location and great weather. I should be out there, really, rather than inside. But yeah, it's a great honour to speak here. I've been doing a lot of events around the 40th anniversary of the miners' strike, but today I wanted to focus on looking at the National Union of Mine Workers, the histories of the National Union of Mine Workers, archives, and I'll touch a little bit on what I think are the new directions in terms of research and how we can tap in to the archives to tell different types of stories about the British coal industry in general and the National Union of Mine Workers in particular. Just a bit of kind of biographical background and how I came to this in terms of the archives. As already mentioned, I was a coal miner starting in 1985, so just after the 12-month dispute in North Wales. And what was really clear to me once I started as an underground miner at that time is that there was already battles taking place about the history of the mining industry and the history of the National Union of Mine Workers, and that's continued down to the present day, and this will come out very strongly in the archives that are now deposited at the Modern Record Centre in Warwick. So it was a real honour for me to be involved in looking into how we preserve the archives, not just of the National Union of Mine Workers, but also its affiliated areas, because, as Liz will probably mention, in the NUM headquarters in Barnsley, they also contained the records of the Yorkshire Miners Association, latterly the Yorkshire area of the National Union of Mine Workers. I was doing some research there, and just the kind of state of disrepair the parts of the building was in, but also how the records were being corrupted by leaks in the roof, by pigeons in some of the rooms. I mean, it was just it was a real kind of crisis situation. So we were doing what we could to try and find a strategy to preserve those records. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. The other thing that was fascinating for me, because as I started life as a coal miner, I quickly became active in the National Union of Mine Workers and was elected as the youth delegate for my local lodge. And when I was working through the Barnsley collection, I started seeing references to myself and other family members, and that was a really kind of strange experience of being now a professor of labour history, but seeing things that I produced in the archive. And I think I was thinking about this from the perspective of a researcher and the perspective of a historian, because there was a letter that I published in the Miner, which was the newspaper for the National Union of Mine Workers, I think in 1988. And when I read that, I thought, I don't think I would say this now, and I was quite embarrassed about it. So it got me thinking about how we research, how we use archives, and this whole question about intentionality and what position people were in at the time they contributed to that archive, what they'd written, what they had said. And I'll touch on that a little bit later as well when we come back. The other point I'd mention as part of this short introduction is the way in which now history is of crucial importance for what we would call now post-coal or post-industrial communities. And I think this is a crucial bit of what we're doing in terms of preserving the NUM archive. I think in almost all former coalfields now, there are at least one heritage group. In some, there's different heritage groups. In Nottingham, for example, in some of the coalfields that were divided during the 84-85 strike, which I'll come to a little bit later, there's a battle over preservation, there's a battle over curation, and there's a battle over memory. And again, the NUM archive, now we have it there in Warwick, will open up more avenues for research into the complexity of the coalfields and the kind of differing political cultures of each of the coalfields, which became brutally exposed in 1984, 1985. So that's my kind of way into the archives. It's really part of my own history in terms of my family background, going back generations in the Lancashire and the Welsh coalfields, but also as an active researcher within Labour history, and particularly within the history of the British coalfields and the National Union of Mine Workers. And I just wanted to touch on this history as I go through my bit of this presentation, because what we've seen in the last few years in terms of the preservation of the National Union of Mine Workers archive is a further step in recovering and preserving mining records reaching back to the 19th century. And the availability of those records has really mapped the development of not just labour history, but in particular coal mining history. And some of you who are interested in mining history and the history of the British labour movement will know that the Communist Party Historians Group had a real significant input into the preservation of mining records and into the history of the National Union of Mine Workers. The kind of most dominant publications for many years were the 4 volumes authored by Robin Page Arnott, himself a member of the Communist Party. And those volumes were written with the kind of official support of the National Union of Mine Workers, and the 4 volumes are published between 1949. The industry had been nationalised in 1947, and the last volume is published in 1979, which is arguably that key year when Margaret Thatcher was elected, and as we know, the rest is history. You know, the coalfields are decimated. So tracking that historiography, I think, not only tells you about the way in which the availability of mining archives were now usable for historians, but also the way in which trends in the writing of labour history and social history were developing from the 1940s and 1950s and down to the present day. And I'll come back to this in my concluding comments. One of the strengths of these early volumes and the Page Arnott volumes, which are followed by other regional histories, is that they draw centrally on the official archives of the National Union of Mine Workers. That's a real strength, that this material was available. However, the weakness is that they were kind of written within, I guess you could call it, an institutional kind of framework, an institutional straitjacket. So they were using the minutes of the National Union of Mine Workers. They were using the official records. So what you get is a very narrow, top-down, institutional, organisational history of the NUM, which obviously leaves a lot of individuals, a lot of communities and a lot of themes out of that history and out of that story. And in recent years, that has begun to become rectified by a younger generation of historians. The weakness of those histories and the institutional nature of them was that they were heavily imprinted by the politics of the Communist Party and the politics of the left of the labour movement as we developed through the 1960s and 1970s. One other one I would pick out here would be Vic Allen's Militancy of the British Miners, which was published in 1981. Again, another crucial period. 1981, there's a threat to close more pits. There's a U-turn done by the Conservative government, and then that leads to the strike of 84, 85. And I think the problem, when we look at this through the prism of 84, 85, is both the Page Arnott volumes, which are published between the 40s and the 70s, and the Vic Allen volume published in 1981, has a very strong sense of optimism and a very strong sense of the unified nature of the National Union of Mine Workers and the culture of solidarity that came out of the coalfields and out of that organisational culture. As we see when we get to 1984 and 1985, that solidarity proves to be brittle as the strike drags on, particularly in the latter stages of the strike when it gets to 7 months and then through to the Christmas period and into the new year. So lots of issues around the politics of it. And I think one of the things that kind of marks that kind of history out to me is that this kind of heroic celebratory history also re-emerged during the strike of 84, 85 and in the aftermath. And again, in more recent years, that has been looked at with a more critical lens, and I'm sure that will come out in some of the Q&A a little bit later. Those institutional histories presented by Page Arnott were followed by a series of regional coalfield studies of the National Union of Mine Workers, Garside's book on the Durham miners, Williams's book on the Derbyshire miners, Andrews Taylor's book on the Yorkshire miners, and there's a whole range of others. I did my own version of this on North Wales in the early 2000s, so I'm kind of criticising my own methodology as well when I talk about the limitations of this kind of study. So that's one kind of wing of the historiography of the National Union of Mine Workers, which I think, will also continue to be built on with the opening up of the NUM archives now at the Modern Record Centre. The other strand, what we see in terms of the availability of archives from constituent organisations of the National Union of Mine Workers, is the writing of labour biographies. And with my other hat on, for many years, I've been an editor of the Dictionary of Labour Biography, and that was the volume 1 of that was published in 1972, and it's an ongoing project that I'm still involved in. The first 2 or 3 volumes of the Dictionary of Labour Biography, the early 1970s period, draws heavily on the opening up of mining archives in the 1960s and 1970s. Some of you will be aware that in the 1960s, there was a huge wave of pit closures. I mean, some coalfields, particularly the northeast, coalfields like Lancashire, were decimated in the 1960s and early 1970s. At that time, there was a similar attempt as to what we've been involved in recent years to preserve the archives of coalfield unions. And that's really what provided the foundation of biographical studies into mining communities and into miners' leaders, and some significant work came out of the availability of those resources. The second part of that, which I think again has left a lasting legacy in terms of labour history, but more specifically mining history, was the development of the South Wales Miners' Library in Swansea in 1973. This was another, intervention by local history groups, the trade union movement, labour historians and universities to try and preserve the minutes of local NUM lodge committees and associated papers that were linked to the history of the South Wales coalfield. Again, this was a huge project, and you can't imagine the same kind of interventions taking place today, bringing together different organisations. And there must be literally hundreds of PhDs, academic articles and academic monographs, as well as public histories that have used resources like the South Wales Miners' Library to write histories of the British coal industry and the National Union of Mine Workers. So that's a kind of very brief survey of the historiography, and again, we can unpick some of this in the Q&A. I want to kind of move towards a conclusion from my bit here, talking about the historiography of the miners' strike of 1984-1985. I've already said that in some ways, the institutional histories and the Communist Party histories and the more radical histories of the National Union of Mine Workers certainly played a role in generating a sense of the solidarity that was embedded in mining communities throughout the 20th century, but also similarly didn't really recognise the divisions and fragmentation within coalfield unions, particularly in the more moderate areas, as we move through to 1983 and 1984. And if we look at the historiography of the strike of 1984-1985, it similarly has that kind of heroic imprint that you find within the volumes of authors like Paige Arnott in the 1940s, 1950s, and Vic Allen in the early 1980s. A lot of the first publications on the strike that came out towards the end of 1985 or in the immediate years that followed tended to be produced by historians who'd been active in support groups during the miners' strike or were heavily in support of the miners' struggle. There are some kind of nuanced publications that come out in between that, but on the whole, they're very supportive of the dispute in 1984 and 1985. And I make the point again about the strengths and weaknesses of that kind of historiography. What those publications did was to remind people of the solidarity of particular coalfields. They told the story from the grassroots up of the miner struggle. Raphael Samuel's Enemy Within is a good example of that history from below, giving voice to the miners themselves and the miners' wives and the miners' families, as opposed to having that purely kind of academic or activist imprint. So that was a real strength. The weakness of that kind of historiography, again, is that it kind of constructed this idea of the militant miner, the solidarity, and this heroic narrative. The recent publications on the strike, some of them have also kind of tapped into some of those mythologies. The recent book by Robert Gildart, Backbone of the Nation, the subtitle is The Great Miners' Strike. So the kind of word great now is attached to the miners' strike. And that's an interesting development from the immediate post-strike aftermath. And even in our kind of more general readings of mining history now, and this is something that I've been working on during my own research, it's almost as if now that the miners have been rendered powerless, they've gone from being the enemies within, as they were constructed by the right, and even some on the left in the early and mid-1980s, to almost becoming national treasures. You know, the strike of 84-5 now is now read through the prism of images such as kind of cinematic representations that you get in films like Brastoff and Billy Elliot. And that's, I think another fascinating aspect of this. Once they no longer have the economic or political power, they're now kind of rendered, very differently or constructed very differently within the popular memory. And I think that's something we can come back to in a moment as well. So, just to conclude here, this is a kind of 2-hour talk that I've compressed into a kind of very short period here. Looking at the strengths and weaknesses of that historiography, where do we go from here? Well, I'm really happy to say, and I think the NUM archives now at the MRC are going to generate even more interest in this. Because of that gap between the end of the strike in 1985 and where we are now in 2024 and everything that's happened, there's a new generation of mining historians, both at the level of the public, so amateur historians and local historians, but also academic historians that are now using kind of different lenses and different methodologies to look at the history of the coal industry and to look at the history of the National Union of Mine Workers. A recent book by Natalie Tomlinson and Florence Sutcliffe Braithwaite on women in the miners' strike has been beginning to do that, to kind of move away from some of these heroic standard images of women in mining communities. That's just one example there. Others are looking at the cultural politics of mining communities, but also the everyday lives of mining communities outside of the realms of trade union activism and the kind of formal politics connected to some of the big events in mining history, like the 1926 lockout and the 1984-85 miners' strike. What more should we be doing here? I think there's so much more to do. I think there's a lot of voices and a lot of regions, a lot of communities that have been absent from the dominant historiography within the coal industry. There's still lots to be done on gender, on masculinity, on sexuality within mining communities. I think these are kind of ripe for research now. And I think that the archives that we have there will uncover some of these hidden histories and some of these marginalised voices. So I'm very optimistic, in the same way that, Paige Arnott and others were in the 1940s and 1950s, and historians like Di Smith and Howard Francis were in the 1980s, about the future of not just coal mining history, but labour history more generally. And that's my bit.
Thank you so much, Keith. Thank you for that extremely comprehensive whiz through the historiography, raising lots of really interesting questions I hope that we'll touch on later. I'll hand straight over to you, Liz.
Thank you very much. So, thanks for that. And I'm Liz Wood. As has been alluded to, I'm with the Archivists at the Modern Records Centre, University of Warwick. I've worked at the MRC since 2006, but for the past 14 months I've been the project archivist working on the NUM collection. The majority of my bit of the panel will be talking generally about the NUM archives and the work that we've been doing to conserve and catalogue them, with the final part of my section looking more specifically at material relating to the 1984 and 1985 strike. I started cataloguing the NUM archives last year, in February 2023, but the work behind the preservation of the collection started in 2016 and was driven by the NUM itself. in particular Paul Darlow, with the backing of the General Secretary, Chris Kitchen. Paul's a former mine worker, a teacher and a historian who's one of the most knowledgeable people you'll meet about the history of the Yorkshire miners and its deep roots in the local communities. Go to the next slide. So, when Paul started working on the NUM archives, they were kept in the Union's headquarters in Barnsley. The Barnsley HQ is a fantastic building, and if you get a chance to visit, I highly recommend it. But it's a working building of offices and meetings, not designed for archival storage. As tends to be the case, the archives were in the bits of the building that weren't needed for other things. The attics, the basement, and a series of rooms off the garage. In total, at least 8 rooms filled with boxes, volumes and magazine files. Some of the storage areas were damp and others had issues with pests. Pigeons have been mentioned. The archives of the mining unions tell a central story in British history. If they were to survive long term, the NUM archives needed specialist conservation treatment and dry, cool archival storage. In an ideal world, the NUM would have the funding to build their own history centre, where their museum and archive collections would be managed and maintained locally in an environmentally controlled building with specialist staff. But that wasn't feasible. In Paul Darlow's words, it breaks my heart to say this, but it needs to move. Getting the building converted into an archive would have cost £1 million and taken years. We didn't have years. We knew you had to go to a professional archives. The NUM started an initial scoping exercise with the support of the University of Nottingham in 2017. The Modern Records Centre, MRC, got involved in 2018, and a year later it was agreed that the collection would come to us. So, why the Modern Records Centre and what is it? Essentially, the Modern Records Centre at the University of Warwick is the main place of deposit in the UK for trade union archives, covering everything from the Trade Union Congress to small niche organisations like the National Glass Bottle Makers Society. The MRC was founded in 1973 specifically to preserve primary sources related to labour history and industrial relations, in particular national records and trade unions. We were created because of a concern that those key records for British history were being lost as unions amalgamated, moved offices, or just had a clear out. Once the MRC was set up, there was a central repository that could take the material, provide suitable storage conditions, catalogue the collections, and make them available to researchers. Therefore, if the NUM collection was unable to be kept in Barnsley, we were a natural home for it. However much of a natural fit we were, we could only take what would be a massive collection, literally thousands of packed boxes, if we had the physical space. Normally, if you ask an archivist whether they got room in the stores for several thousand more boxes, you'll be met with hysterical laughter. Fortunately, the offer of the NUM collection coincided with the University of Warwick committing to building us new off-site storage. And the images you can see behind me are photographs of that off-site storage. Without that coincidence, it would have been really, really difficult for us to take the collection. With the support of the Society for the Study of Labour History and people like Keith, we got funding from the Wellcome Trust, National Manuscripts Conservation Trust and the Pilgrim Trust to cover the conservation and cataloguing of the equivalent of about 4 lorry loads of archives. The lockdowns and restrictions during COVID delayed both the construction of our store and our work with the NUM in Barnsley by several years. Once things did actually get going again, we went up to Barnsley, identified the material that was being transferred, and finally, in the summer of 2022, the move was on. So, the initial stage of the project was the conservation work undertaken by the specialist firm Harwells, who are essentially the only company in the UK with the capacity to take on this huge quantity of material. Their job was to stabilise the collection so that it wouldn't degrade any further and so that it would be safe for archive staff and researchers to handle. This involved freeze and vacuum drying everything to remove damp, irradiating it to kill mould and any insect life, removing the worst of the dust and dirt, and repackaging it into acid-free archive boxes. The next stage of the project, which is where we are at the moment, is the cataloguing. The grant provided funds for a 3-year Project Archivist post to catalogue the collection that I started in February last year. So 3 years, why is the cataloguing taking so long? The short answer is the sheer quantity of material. We've got larger collections at the MRC, but all of those came to us over a number of years in different stages. This is probably the largest quantity of material that we've ever got in one go. The first stage of the cataloguing is physically looking through everything, identifying what's there and producing a rough list. I've done that now with just under 3/4 of the collection. That's over 9,000 entries on the spreadsheet so far. I'm hoping that I'll have done a first pass through the whole lot by autumn this year, fingers crossed, and then we'll be able to start making the Mining Union archives available to researchers in stages. The smaller, earlier collections like the South Yorkshire Miners Association and Cumberland Miners Association will be publicly available first, as they're quicker to do, and the biggest part of all, which is the main NUM archives, should hopefully be available by either late next year or early 2026. As I go through, as well as cataloguing, I'm also doing a bit of basic cleaning. These are a couple of before and after images of a document which was stored on open shelves for a few years. By using a smoke sponge, which sort of absorbs the dirt, you can remove a lot of the surface grime and get it in a suitable state for researchers to look at. As you may have seen on the previous image, some of the documents have rusty paper clips or pins attached. I'm removing those, replacing them with more archive-friendly alternatives. So I've been talking about the NUM archive in general, so what's actually in this massive collection? The largest part of the NUM collection is, unsurprisingly, the central records of the National Union of Mine Workers. A whole range of administrative material, research papers, publicity material dating from the union's formation in 1945. Unfortunately, there's very little for the pre-1945 National Union, the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, as a lot of the MFGB's records were destroyed during the Second World War. At a regional or area level, the collection includes a large amount of material related to the Yorkshire mining unions, from the South and West Yorkshire Miners Associations in the mid-19th century to the post-1945 Yorkshire area of the NUM, as well as smaller amounts of material relating to some of the other regional areas or federations. The NUM archives include sources relating to health and welfare, hence the grant from the Wellcome Trust, wages and working conditions, industrial disputes and negotiations, nationalisation, the International Trade Union and Labour Movement, and some membership records from the early years of the Yorkshire unions. So what's in there about the 1984-85 miners' strike? To some extent, I'm still finding out. The oldest and worst affected material went through conservation first, so that's what's been catalogued first. Much of the material from the 70s, 80s and 90s is in the final quarter of the collection, a bit that I haven't properly looked at yet. Based on what I've seen so far, the collection will include records at a national level relating to the administration of the dispute, committee minutes, updates and reports about the progress of the strike, negotiations with the NCB, relations with other unions and so on, together with some administrative material from the Yorkshire area. There'll be a range of campaign and publicity material relating to the strike, produced both by the NUM and some support groups, such as Women Against Pit Closures. Some of the posters and leaflets found so far in the NUM archive were shown on the previous slide. The union kept examples of both letters of support and of opposition, and you might recognise the logo on the slide behind me. This is a letter that was found in one of the NUM correspondence files, in which the Marx Memorial Library contacted the NUM in 1985 to ask about collecting material to do with the strike. The collection also includes documents to do with what was termed the breakaway, the challenge of the UDM from 1985 onwards, and the NUM's campaign for one union. These include papers about the legal challenges brought against the NUM during the dispute and publicity material putting forward the NUM's case. And in the period after the strike, as the union's predictions about pit closures came true, the NUM archives include files relating to the Coalfield Communities campaign and the attempts to save collieries from closure at national and local level. What you're less likely to find in this collection is the view from the ground. Records relating to a more rank and file perspective of the strike are more likely to be found through collections elsewhere, for example in archives compiled by individual members or branches, or history interviews, or the collections of people involved in local support groups. What I'm looking forward to as the cataloguing continues is finding links, common threads between the 1984-5 strike records and other archives. That includes looking back at the past history of the NUM, looking, for example, at the successful strikes of the early 70s and how tactics like the use of flying pickets were developed, and the slide shows some of the 1970s campaign material from the NUM collection. It also involves looking at the broader context of the trade union movement in the 80s, seeing the interactions, tensions and support between the NUM, the TUC and other unions. One of the documents that's been passed on to us, which rather contradicts my point about rank and file records, is a self-published book by Malcolm Kitchen, father of the current NUM General Secretary, which reproduces extracts from his diary during the strike with photos and copies of leaflets. One of the lines includes a throwaway reference to attending a rally addressed by the General Secretary of the National Union of Public Employees, who at the time was Rodney Bickerstaff. We got Rodney's archives and those of UP. Both, of course, include material relating to the miners' strike. Inevitably, there were many different overlaps, interactions and threads between the NUM archive and other collections at the MRC, as well as with sources held elsewhere in other archives, libraries and homes. When the 40th anniversary of the start of the strike came around in March, although cataloguing the NUM archive itself was still a work in progress, we were able to use the other resources in our collections to mark the anniversary. We've put on a physical exhibition looking at the themes of community, conflict, support groups and the dispute locally in Coventry, part of which is shown in the photograph here. This drew on a mix of collections at the MRC, including archives of trade unions like NUP, which contains sources about the strike at both national and local level, the archives of political activists, which include some great small print run leaflets and other ephemeral items relating to solidarity work, and local to us, Coventry Trades Council material, which includes documents relating to the strike in Coventry and Warwickshire. The local situation for us was mixed. Kersley Pit, also known as Coventry Colliery, was mostly out during the strike. Door Mill up by Nuneaton stayed working. Also, to mark the 40th anniversary, we digitised just under 100 items of ephemera, leaflets, bulletins, pamphlets and so on, which were produced either by the NUM or by local support groups. This includes material which presents the NUM's case against the pit closures, and a lot of items relating to fundraising, food collections, and demonstrations in support of the striking miners. The digitised collection is a resource that will remain online, which is free for anyone to access. The image of the screenshot is a leaflet that was produced by Barnsley Women Against Pit Closures. As the work on the NUM archive continues over the next couple of years, we hope to continue to make links within our own collections and with archives, researchers and generally interested people. Once the first phase of cataloguing is out of the way and we begin to know what's in those thousands of boxes, hopefully by later this year, we can begin to properly open it up to people. The grant that we've received from the Welcome will also fund an outreach post. Later on this year, once that first stage of the cataloguing is hopefully completed, we'll have more conversations with the NUM, organisations like the Society for the Study of Labour History, researchers like Keith and others, about the different ways that we might better provide or enhance access to the collection over the next few years. The archive of the National Union of Mine Workers is a fantastic collection rooted in communities and a key part of our national history. It's a privilege to work on it, and I look forward to continuing to share it.
Thank you so much, Liz.
And that's my bit.
Astounded by the scale of the job, but also the enormous value, like you said, as a piece of social and political history. We're going to wrap up with Matt making some of those connections. I hope you've mentioned some links with our archives.
Hi, so my name is Matt Dunne and I am the archivist here at the Marx Memorial Library, and I'm also the project archivist here on a 2-year project to catalogue the collection that we have concerning print workers' unions, particularly the Wapping dispute. I'm going to be talking about some of the material that we hold in the library on the miners' strike. Some of it might be in some unexpected places in our collections, and I'll be looking at the story it tells, how we came to collect that material and why we place such importance on collecting material like that in the MML. So this all starts in October 1984, which is 7 months into the strike, and the MML secretary, Max Egelnick, sent a letter around the country to all NUM regions. After offering solidarity and recognising the huge importance of the strike, he explained that MML is the most outstanding library of the British labour movement in the country, if not internationally, and that it was anxious to help preserve for use by future generations material of the miners' historic struggle. He went on to say we would greatly appreciate it if, when you have a moment, you could arrange for material to be sent to us with which your area has been involved, such as leaflets, papers, articles, booklets, etc. And he wraps up this letter by saying, it does not matter what it is, please send it and we will sort it out, which is a very generous offer. But as an archivist, i.e. one of the people that is being offered to sort that out, it does fill me with a slight sense of panic reading that. So what this letter shows is that MML actually started to collect archive material to preserve during the strike itself, which in the middle of such a huge struggle, I think shows incredible foresight, as well as an understanding of the role that the library itself could play within that struggle, perhaps almost uniquely at that time. The response to the letter is fascinating, and it forms the basis of what is, compared to the NUM archives, a relatively small but still very rich collection of material produced in support of the strike from all around the country. It includes material from the NUM itself, local support groups in mining and non-mining areas, from a range of socialist organisations, students, musicians, feminists, peace activists. It has a huge amount of posters, leaflets, newsletters, all advertising the latest on the strike, upcoming events and actions. I think together it gives this amazing sense of what's happening on the ground in support of the strike in various walks of life. Since then, since the end of the strike, we have continued to acquire much more material, and now original documents from and commemorating the strike can be found in many parts of the library's collections. And this includes papers from individual striking miners reflecting on their experience of the strike, papers from activists involved in some of the support groups around the country, pamphlets and periodicals that have been donated to us over the years, commemorative plates from NUM pits, regions and Women Against Pit Closures groups, and some of them can be seen in the stairwell just outside this room. And finally, we have a great wealth of solidarity actions represented in our print workers collection. So I suspect that in 1984, all that material that was donated, a lot of it was probably just sent to the library with no explanation. But there are a few letters in amongst that collection replying to Egonek, which I think are quite revealing. There's one response from Durham, which promises to send archive material once they have tidied their office. And again, reading that as an archivist, there's that slight moment of panic. But the letter says, it seems that what you are trying to do is sadly a thing that has been neglected over many years. And I know in this part of the country in particular, many relics have been allowed to just disappear. There's another letter from the South Wales Miners' Library, which perhaps unsurprisingly was trying to collect in their region around the strike at the time. And this reports that miners were anxious for records of the strike and of their union to be kept, but also for members of the unions to have access to them. So both of these letters, I think, quite neatly answer the question of why do we collect? Why do we bother doing that in the first place? And they show the need within the movement for organisations like MML and a lot of others around the country to document and preserve the history of the labour movement, and that without actively doing that activity, the history will be lost forever. In some way or another, MML has been doing this since its founding in 1933, with its original aim being to preserve knowledge of socialism at a time when in parts of the world that knowledge and heritage was being actively destroyed by fascism. Perhaps less obvious than the kind of outright destruction that came through fascism, historically archives have been less likely to include material from labour and protest movements. And instead, the wealthy, businesses and those with political power have usually been vastly overrepresented in them. And this means that there's very often a limited or more one-sided view of history actually baked into the historical record, and a lot of narratives are excluded. But throughout the 20th century, protest movements, minority groups responded to this by campaigning for inclusion in archives held by universities and local authorities, but also by setting up their own independent institutions to record their history, like MML. In addition to just being willing to document this history, I think the collecting during a strike by MML shows an understanding of what might be worth collecting, what might be important for future generations. And I think that that's best placed to come from people within that movement who are already involved in those struggles perhaps, or at least very, very closely aligned to them. So a lot of the material we hold on the miners' strike tells stories that might otherwise be hidden. Some are lesser known, particularly to new generations of activists, and some challenge political narratives and narratives about the strike. One thing I think that is demonstrated very well here, and links to the panel discussion that we had last week, is the extensive network of solidarity that extended around the country and tapped into a wider political and labour movement. Some of the material we have on display shows, at the back of the room, shows solidarity links in places that might not be immediately obvious. So support extends way beyond pit villages. In the collections we have, there are lots of London groups set up to raise much needed funds for miners. But we also have material from students and peace campaigners who are taking action to highlight the shared links between their struggles and the miners. But one of the major links within the labour movement itself with the miners' strike is represented in our print workers collection. It's especially relevant to point this out today because this is the 40th anniversary of the Sun having to go to print with a banner headline and a photo removed after print workers refused to print a defamatory article about Arthur Scargill. It was a photo that was taken from a dodgy angle, looked like he was doing a Nazi salute with the headline, Mein Führer, spelled M-I-N-E. So they refused to print that as one of their acts of solidarity with miners, and it just had to go to print with this blank apology, basically. As well as that, within the print workers collection, there are examples of solidarity rallies, demonstrations and picket supports, but the real main act of solidarity I think that comes through is fundraising, both from within the print workers unions and just generally on Fleet Street. One of the, I think, most incredible and most moving parts of this is a letter from a miners' family that we have on display today to an MGA member who was later sacked during the Wapping dispute, and he was an organiser in the City Miners Support Committee. The letter thanks him for sending toys to the miners' family so that their children could have Christmas presents that year. The description in the letter, it really shows everything in the strike. It's got women against pit closures, picking for coal, picketing, fundraising, soup kitchens, as well as hope and worries, frustrations. But all of this is from an ordinary family's point of view. Something that I quite like about it, this is the first letter in a series of letters, and there's a lot of back and forth between the two families, and the children from each family actually become pen pals and do eventually meet in London. And I think that's a really nice example of how solidarity can be passed on through generations. One of the big examples of fundraising that came from the print workers' unions was in the summer of 1984, when the print union SOGAP organised a convoy to travel from London to pit villages throughout the north at a time when miners desperately needed resources. But all of this solidarity is reciprocated by miners a couple of years later during the Wapping dispute. And we have, within the print workers collection, letters from miners offering support to print workers in that dispute, often remembering specific actions that the print workers did. And in some cases, they're offering advice. There's actually a letter that we've got out today that says, sings the praises of women against pit closures and suggests that print workers should have women involved in the dispute as well. What I think is really interesting about those personal letters is that all of them see the struggles as very much linked. They're not separate in their eyes. Lastly, we have, within this collection, we have, and I think this is often overlooked, we have material from this nationwide support network that existed during the miners' strike being resurrected and repurposed during the Wapping dispute. So very often we have exactly the same local groups, I assume, with the same people involved in them being repurposed. We also have some things from lesbians and gays support print workers, as was lesbians and gays support the miners, as well as women against Murdoch, influenced by women against pit closures. I find all of this solidarity particularly relevant as a counter to attempts to paint history in a particular political light, because it challenges Thatcher's idea that underpinned her attacks on unions at that time of there being no such thing as society. But it also moves away from this idea that history is made exclusively by people in power, and shows the extraordinary actions taken by ordinary people that found themselves in an extraordinary situation. But as well as reflecting on the past, this collection, or these collections, can also be used for the future. So in MML, our collections are used in workshops for new generations of socialists and trade unionists. And we also use our collections in school workshops where students learn about socialism and trade unionism, sometimes literally for the very first time. But I think it's also useful so that the movement can learn from itself. As I said, during Wapping, this whole support network was resurrected, but that was in very recent memory of the miners' strike and had some of the same people involved in it. But by preserving collections like this, we collectivise that memory so that going forward for future generations, we can learn, or the movement can learn from its past.
Thank you so much, Matt.